We've got such a fantastic session ahead of us this afternoon, and I'm so glad that so many of you have signed up to join us, and I can't wait to get it started in just a moment. Let's just make sure we're live on Facebook. Yes, we are. Hello, Facebook. Perfect. Hello, Jessica. There's 31 of you. I'm not seeing many shout outs in the chat, people to shout out in the chat otherwise though, so let's change that. In the meantime, a tiny bit of housekeeping. Unfortunately, I am the bearer of bad news to announce that unfortunately Josh Rivers is not able to make it for this afternoon's panel. He's not very well. So Josh, if you are watching this, we're wishing you very well and hope you recover soon. And we'll touch bases soon. Hi, Jackie from Lichfield, from the East Midlands. Hi, Gareth. Oh, love it. But yes, so nonetheless, we still have a fantastic panel joining us this afternoon. We're going to be talking about a number of fantastic topics and really fascinating aspects of LGBT plus history. So I'm really, really glad to have them there. I'm looking at the time and I'm conscious that we only have the hour, so I think it's time we get started. And I'll start with saying hello, welcome. My name is George Wright, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm the head of social media here at My G Work, the LGBTQ plus business community. If you've not heard of us before, that's perfectly fine. We are a platform for professionals, graduates, inclusive employers, really anyone that believes in workplace equality to come together to build networks, access events like these, as well as accessing news and inclusive jobs. We advertise about 100,000 inclusive jobs around the world with 300 inclusive companies, including companies represented by our partners here. Welcome to our LGBTQ plus history panel, sponsored by Synchron. Big thank you to them for sponsoring this session. And before I talk much more, I think it's time we meet our panelists. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and then we can get on with this session. So I'm going to come to Lee first. Would you mind introducing yourself, Lee?
Hi, George, and thank you. Yes, my name's Lee Perry. I'm a research scientist at GlaxoSmithKline, and I'm also a member of our UK leadership team for Spectrum, which is our LGBTQ employee resource group.
Excellent, thank you so much. Emily, how would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Emily Hamilton. I'm Vice President of Strategic Change at RS Components, and I'm also Director of an organisation called Trans in the City here in the UK.
Thank you very much. We'll come down to Emily Wilson. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Emily Wilson, and I'm a user experience designer at Synchron, based in the greater New York City area. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Cassius, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm Cassius Naylor. I am the Global Communications Coordinator at the Financial Times, and I am the UK co-chair of Proud FT, which is our LGBT employee network.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cassius. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself to our...
Yeah, thanks. I'm Stephen Guerrero, and I teach middle school ancient history just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And I also work with History Unerased, which is an organization that develops inclusive curriculum for K through 12 classrooms in the US. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And finally, last but not least, very capable moderator, Frank, to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Frank. I'll be moderating today's call. As a subset of HR, I work on Synchron's immigration team. I also work to expand diversity, equity, and inclusion practice within the organization through various initiatives, corporate partnerships, and community engagements.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now that we've met the panel, I think it's time we start. Please, Frank, the floor is yours.
All right, wonderful. Again, thank you everyone for your time today. So excited to learn myself. Personally, I identify as part of the LGBT community, and there's still so much of the history that I don't know. And so I think any opportunity I can get to collaborate with other individuals to kind of promote the message and, just work towards a more inclusive future that represents all of us. So again, thank you all. Very excited to be here. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Emily Hamilton, let's begin with you. Would you like to introduce kind of the organization you work for? And then I can go ahead and mention like our topic and then go forward with questioning.
Great, thank you. Yes, so I work for an organization called RS Components. We are part of the Electro Components group, and we are a global distributor of components and other items known as Allied in the US for any US people who are joining us today. And in terms of my topic for today, I'll be talking a little bit about the impact of the British Empire in what we see today in homophobia and transphobia around the world and the roots of that.
Very, very good topic because, as we mentioned the other day, there's a lot of tension going on in the UK right now and really all over the world, unfortunately, with different elements bringing on these tensions. Let's begin, though, with, as colonial law, with the topic of today. What is the Buggery Act?
Well, the Buggery Act of 1533. So for those of you who know your history, that was the reign of Henry VIII in the UK, quite a well-known monarch. And I guess I should preface what I'm saying by saying that the purpose we talk about these things is, as it says on the walls of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., past is prologue. And what we saw then still has emphasis on today. So the Buggery Act of 1533 was brought in, and to use the words of the Act, it was to counter sexual acts against the order of nature. And it was a quite broad-ranging piece of legislation, which meant that basically any sexual act which was not for the purpose of procreation was prohibited, and the sentence, the penalty for being convicted under that act was death. So the death penalty was prescribed, and that act lived on the statute book with one change to it until 1828 in the UK, when it was replaced with an equally pernicious act, which carried on the prohibition of certainly homosexual relationships. So any sort of same-sex relationships were prohibited. But the Buggery Act in and of itself covered not only same-sex relationships and non-procreational sex, but any actions which were much, much broader. So bestiality was mentioned in there. So what it did effectively was lumped the LGBT community as we would now know it with people who were engaged in things like bestiality. So some of those awful tropes that we've seen come time and time again really had their seeds back in the 16th century.
Oh, so, you mentioned the year that it was implemented. I imagine the reaction was not great. What did that look like? Do you know?
Well, the reaction at the time, I mean, it was one of a number of measures in that period. And as with a lot of laws passed during that period, and certainly during the reign of Henry VIII, there was an ulterior motive. It was used not necessarily as a means of what they would consider a moral imperative, but more as a very blunt weapon to bludgeon the enemies of the king. So one of the first people to be prosecuted and tried under it was, in fact, a member of the king's household. There is very little evidence that he was engaged in any act which would be contrary to the law, but it was used as a means to imprison and then execute that person. So, as with a lot of medieval laws, there was a bit of an ulterior motive behind it.
Sure. And unfortunately, there are even laws present, actually in many parts of the world, that still marginalize communities that are fighting for inclusion and just to be heard and represented in senior government leadership positions and, a number of other places. So, all right. So you talked a little bit about the reaction. Now, how did it affect the LGBT community within the UK once the Buggery Act was implemented?
Well, effectively, I mean, a lot of the roots of this come down to religious influence, and again, there are sadly some echoes of that into the present day, where religious mores start to involve themselves in day-to-day life, into people's existence, and certainly that's where that came from. So this sense that sex was purely for the procreation of children. In fact, those words were used in the marriage ceremony and still can be used in marriage ceremonies, that marriage is the purpose of the procreation of children. Anything like that was seen, anything outside of that, the marriage between a man and a woman, the procreation of children, any sort of sexual activity was seen as being sinful. And this was the first time that sense of religious sin was codified into the statute book. So in terms of prosecutions, there were multiple prosecutions. There were multiple executions over the years. In fact, the last person executed was in 1835 under the changes within that act. But I think it's the fact that it had a massive impact on well, it wouldn't have been British people then because Britain as a concept didn't exist, but certainly on English people during that period. It's very hard to count because, looking back into the records and working out which particular aspect of the act was a target against the LGBT community and which of it was just somebody being prosecuted because that was a handy way of getting rid of them. It's very difficult to discern that. I think where it becomes more troublesome from my perspective as a British person speaking is when we think about the British Empire and the influence of the British Empire in exporting that sort of thing around the world.
That brings me to a good point. Speaking of the world, you kind of mentioned a little bit about how the uptake was on a national level within the UK or within England at that time. What was the global reaction? Was there any kind of pushback from other nations that may have not agreed with that stance?
No, I mean in that period, it's very difficult to look back. I mean, history is not written very well at that period. But if you think in terms of that religious sense around the world, it was pretty homogenous, certainly in the European sphere. Where you start to see that becoming codified globally is really into the 19th century. So there was certainly a period in British history at the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century where Britain wasn't a particularly religious place. This sense that there was this Victorian morality that we talk about, that was certainly not a concept in Georgian England. So the period in which America was breaking free, what you did have were you had the Puritans, you had certainly that non-conformist tradition coming in. But in terms of the state religion, Catholicism was suppressed in the UK. So Catholicism wasn't actually taken out of the shadows until 1829, until the Catholic Emancipation Acts. So Catholics weren't allowed to hold public office, for example, until that point. And the established church didn't have its hold on British society as it does today. It was much more a question around nonconformity. What you did start to see, though, in that Victorian period, so after the 1830s, was the resurgence of both the Catholic faith in the UK, but also the counter to that, which was in things like the Oxford movement in the Anglican tradition, where you started to see a much broader aspect of religious influence on public life. And what that culminated in, and what brings it to the empire element, was the penal code. So the colonial penal codes, which were codified in 1860 to 1861, adopted wholesale in the British colonies. And remember, the British Empire covered 24% of the landmass of the planet at one stage. The penal code, so section 377 of the colonial penal code, effectively lifted the words from the Buggery Act of 1533 and put it into law in lots of places in the world. And the problem was, as the British Empire went into retreat in the Edwardian period through the early part of the 20th century, so we saw countries moving away from the British Empire getting independence, what you saw was those countries retaining, even to the number, section 377 of the penal code, which forbade sexual acts against the order of nature. So if you think about that, what that means today, 70 countries in the world it is illegal to be LGBT. 7 countries retain the death penalty. Real crossover there with other religions. There are some, obviously, Islamic countries where there is an influence there which were not part of the British Empire. But if I were to reel them off now, Bangladesh, Jamaica, Malaysia, Myanmar, Pakistan, Singapore, Sri Lanka, all retain section 377 in their current penal codes today. So their anti-LGBT activity, their activity around prosecuting people for having the identity of being LGBT, is a direct descendant from the British penal codes of the 1860s and the Buggery Act of 1533. And as a British person who, when I travel, I have to look and see if I can safely be there, that for me is a source of shame. It's something we have to reflect on. We have to look at ourselves. We also have to look, and I will finish up here because I'm conscious we've got lots to talk about, but we have to think about what that did to the indigenous cultures of those countries, many of which had cultures which recognized same-sex relationships as being completely usual. They were just a normal part of those cultures, and third genders. So if we think about things like the Apwind people of Myanmar, the third gender, absolutely criminalized by the British and criminalized to this day because of what we did. So when people start to talk about backward countries, and you'll see people say, oh, these backward countries, these awful 70 countries, actually in many cases, the reason they have these regressive laws against the LGBT community is as a legacy of empire. not as something which is culturally part of their tradition. Go to northern India, look at the temple carvings, you will see transgender people depicted in temple carvings. You will see same-sex relationships. These things predated the British takeover of India through the 18th century and obviously into the British Raj period in the late 19th century. So these traditions were there. LGBT people have been there since people existed. It is the laws of human beings, the laws of people, the laws of religions getting into the secular space that cause these problems.
And you bring a great point. You know, biologically speaking, we see homosexuality in animals. We see homosexuality across the board. You know, and so with that being said, you touched on the penal code, the consequences of the people in other nations. And, you know, from one perspective, you know, a long time ago, I could see, you know, a lot of people looking up to the UK or to England at the time and thinking, why reinvent the wheel? That looks fine to me, you know, but the problem is that set a very dangerous precedent that still is lingering today. One final question I have for you, and then we can move on, is you mentioned the 7 countries that still have these laws prohibiting, you know, sexual acts just to different levels. That being said, are they still enforced in these 7 countries? They're still enforced.
Yes, they are. I mean, there are some nuances. So some of those countries, if they're practicing the death penalty as part of Sharia law, will only prescribe the death penalty for Muslims. But when the law is the law is the law of the land in those countries. And one would ask the question, would you take the risk? So I'll give a very good example, which is going to become very apposite. If you go to Qatar, if you are a soccer fan, a football fan, Qatar World Cup, Qatar is one of those countries that still mandates the death penalty for being LGBT. And when FIFA were challenged on this, their answer was, well, just don't have any public displays of affection and you'll be fine. Now, apart from the fact that's entirely offensive to people to say you have to be invisible, you have to change your way of being, for trans people, that's not an option. We don't have an invisibility cloak. So yes, there might be some nuances. Yes, they may say, well, we don't really kill people. We actually just put them in prison, or we deport them, or we fine them. But if it's on the statute book, and that is a risk that you could be killed, and generally it's death by stoning in some of these countries, is that a risk you're willing to take? I certainly wouldn't.
Right. And I mean, I think that goes for many people. It's really scary. You know, when I was younger, I traveled to Jamaica and I had a great time, only to then learn, you know, fortunately, I didn't experience any negativity or anything, but that Jamaica is not a very forward country as it relates to LGBT inclusivity. So, you know, unfortunately, the sentiment does echo still around the world. And I do hope that, you know, by these sessions, by these panels and discussions, and that we can open up people to, you know, different ways of life and different, you know, ideologies. So, Emily, thank you. Any final thoughts, words you'd like to share with everyone here today?
No, I think the key thing for me is I think there is a great sense of shame as a British person thinking about how we've behaved in the world. But I think, you know, as I said at the very start, the past is prologue. If we don't learn from it, if we don't learn from the mistakes of the past, from the demonization of minorities, we are doomed to repeat them again. So where we are seeing those laws springing up, we're seeing lots of laws in the US, for example, in state houses at the moment, particularly against the trans community, but with broader import. Let's look back and see where these things came from. What's the root of these things? What's the ignorance that caused them to be there? And by being forewarned, by having a knowledge of the history of these things, we have a better chance to counter them now and make lives better for the people who come after us.
I think that was extremely well said. And, you know, I couldn't agree more. So thank you very much. Okay, let's move along to Stephen. Stephen, you are joining us from Unerased, I believe.
History Unerased.
Okay, thank you, TVC Unerased. Tell me a little bit about what you do and what you'll be speaking about today.
Sure, yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I teach middle school ancient history, and I have an ancient history in Greek and Roman studies background. And I work with History Unerased, which is a nonprofit organization that works to create inclusive curriculum for K through 12 schools. And the origin of the name actually gets to something that Emily touched on, which is the unerasure of LGBTQ people in history. And as Emily very powerfully said, we've always been here. We've been here throughout history, even ancient history. It's just that the transmitted knowledge of our existence was purposefully erased, and that this group seeks to kind of unerase the contributions of LGBTQ people in our curricula that we teach kids. I think you're on mute, Frank.
Thank you. I think about 9 months ago, give or take, it's an interesting thing that Scotland became the first country to require LGBT history in schools, implementing it into the curriculum. And what a great way to normalize from a young, early age with developing minds, saying like, you know what, homosexuality didn't start in 2020. You know, it's been here for a very long time. As evidenced by pirates, like we were speaking on that the other day. There's a huge extensive history with pirates and homosexual activity. So that being said, let's move along.
I'm speaking specifically about the Roman experience. And of course, if we're speaking from a UK perspective, a lot of UK law and tradition comes from the Romans. You know, it's hard when we talk about ancient history to identify a wide range of experiences, because what we have are primary sources that are mainly concerned with upper class folks, mainly the literate class, because that's who's writing and reading. We do have some glimpses both through material culture and through law codes on some attitudes about homosexual or same-sex behavior. And I think that's probably the most important difference to identify, is that the ancient Romans were not so interested in identifying labels or identities, but more with behavior. And so when you have someone like Augustus, the first emperor, he has this program of family values, of promoting the traditional Roman family. And of course, this is an extremely patriarchal society. And they're concerned with procreation, with sexuality as it relates to creating heirs and promoting the Roman state. And so you see, even through art, Augustus is promoting things like fertility and prosperity. And a big part of that is how many children a opposite sex couple can produce. And when we get into ideas about same-sex behavior, that's very wrapped up in class, and also with your specific role in the sexual encounter. And so in Roman times, if you were a male of a certain privilege of an upper class, it was seen as something that you could do is engage in homosexual activity, as long as it was with someone of a lower class. And as long as you were the active partner and not the passive partner. So it's like the original bottom shaming. Like it was seen as shameful if you were the passive partner in that relationship. And so we have things like political graffiti about Julius Caesar, talking about, you know, he's every woman's man and every man's woman. And, you know, we don't know the truth of what his actual activities were, but we know that that was weaponized in a way that attacked his manliness. And that was probably, you know, indicative of the fact that, you know, Roman and especially patriarchal societies are very concerned with masculinity and preserving the masculine ideal. We do have some idea about sex workers and enslaved people as sex partners. Of course, that gets into really sticky issues about consent and whether someone who is enslaved can give consent. Of course, they cannot, but we don't have their perspectives because they just, you know, their ideas weren't recorded in a way that is transmitted to us. I think when we get into ideas of kind of gender identity or gender presentation, that's a little bit more complicated. So we know, and of course this was true all the way up until Shakespearean times, you know, men would play women and female roles in the theater. And that goes back to the ancient Greeks. But the theater itself was seen as something of the lower classes. So, you know, a respectable Roman wouldn't, you know, be seen in a theater. Often they were placed a little bit outside of the main city center. And the men, especially in the comedies, who would play women, I don't think it's far off to think of them like we think of drag queens. I don't know if people have watched RuPaul UK, but like that kind of over exaggeration of roles of men and women, I think, is something that's always been kind of played with, but it was always seen as something that is lower class appropriate. We do have some laws in terms of incentivizing families that have many more children. Women are idealized when they have many children. We have historical examples of, Roman mothers who are idealized almost to what we, anachronistically could call sainthood in terms of how many children they can have to adulthood. When the Roman Empire goes Christian, though, in the time of Constantine and after, of course, Christianity brings a whole separate layer that is the beginning of really the idea of homosexual activity being something that is not only for the lower class, but is sinful and that could, endanger your soul. And so we see that kind of moralistic overlay in a way that we hadn't before in the pre-Christian Rome. And the last thing I would say is, the Romans took a lot of cultural adaptations from the Greeks. And so the Greeks have this idea of the idealized male form, and that, the male body was the highest kind of living art form. And that female roles were, of course, subservient in a patriarchal society, but also that this kind of uniform of nakedness that heroes would wear was seen as something that was extremely homoerotic. I mean, if you go to a Greek or Roman collection now in any museum, you'll see that, it does have a very kind of queer perspective when you look at this kind of art. And I think that's why, and I think we'll talk about this with other panelists, that you have something like the Uranian Movement in the late 19th and early 20th century, the kind of a proto-gay rights movement that is related to people like Edward Perry Warren. And I think folks in London who have been to the British Museum know about the Warren Cup, which famously depicts an act of male to male sex. And this Uranian movement traced its roots back to these same-sex relationships in ancient times. And I'll also have to give a shout out to somebody like Hadrian, who idealized his lover Antinous. Hadrian had a wife. He had, heirs that he promoted, but it was seen as something acceptable that he had this Antinous lover who he even, deified after he died tragically, drowning in the Nile River. But that was seen as something of an ideal much later by the Uranians.
Okay. Thank you. That was really helpful. I didn't actually know a lot of that. So that was really brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. You touched on the cultural inclination of procreating, to extend the bloodline, to create heirs, to, procreate, being fundamental. What was the intersection culturally within that time of people that maybe did not agree with that, if that was a thing? Because it seems so normalized at the time to, maybe, like you were mentioning the passive role, active role. So there were, I guess maybe some kind of things with that may have been preferred, culturally speaking, I guess. But how did that reverberate throughout the nation?
So it's very connected to the sexuality, and the kind of male and female binary roles are very connected. So, the passive partner is seen as a more female role, which is also something that is seen as kind of lower or less than. And I also think, this is kind of a side note, but I think that a lot of homophobia actually stems from, a repurposed misogyny, that there's any hatred for this, anything that presents as feminine is also applied to homophobia. And I think that when you think about the ancient Romans, they're so wrapped up in class and family and what your duties were to the state and to your family and to your religion. And so attitudes were more about, like I said, behavior. If a man were seen to be acting womanly, for women, and especially for women having sex with women, we have very little evidence of this. And I think part of that is, of course, our received history. The Romans didn't feel like it was very important to record women's perspectives on a lot of things. And also because it didn't endanger the kind of procreative power or incentive of families. Women on women sexuality was not seen as a danger as male to male sexuality, because in that case, the Romans really saw, this kind of misplaced procreative power, that the man's attention should be on creating more Romans. And it's interesting when we see in the artwork, when we get into like Stoic philosophy and how it relates to art, I've actually read academic journals that talk about why Roman naked statues have such small penises. And part of that is actually they are conferring that when you have an erect penis on like a satyr or, one of these woodland creatures, they are seen as kind of like the unleashing of restraint, this kind of like primal carnal desire. And for the Romans, for the Stoics, that was something that was also shameful. That was not what you did. Like a Roman man was, self-possessed, and he was very controlled, and that he could control his emotions. And I think part of the artwork that we see reflects that kind of control, and the control not only extended to his feelings and his attitudes, but also his family. It's not an accident that the word paterfamilias is a Roman term.
What does that mean? Father of the family?
Or father of the family. So basically like the head of household.
Okay.
And of course, those attitudes, came all the way up. Even in like the US, women couldn't take out, a credit card without their husband's consent up until, 40 or 50 years ago.
That's shocking, but glad that it's not like that anymore for this.
Yeah.
So one more quick question for you, and then we can move along, is you mentioned, let's see here. All right. Anyway, we'll come back to that. What responsibility would you say curators and people that work at museums and, educational institutions like yourself have to ensure that, that's so that we can historically be reviewed authentically and correctly? Yeah,
definitely. And I think, we had this moralistic attitude of museums up until like the early 20th century of, sexuality was something that was shameful and that was not to be seen in Naples, for a very long time, even up until, not that long ago. The sexually explicit artwork from Pompeii was hidden. And in fact, in Italian, it was called the secret cabinet, and that only men could be allowed in there with, the curator's permission. So that's sexuality in general. I think, again, I would go back to what Emily said, which is like queer people have always existed, whether we called them that or they identified as that, or our kind of attitudes today are different from theirs back then. There have always been folks like us in history contributing to the society. And I think museums have an opportunity and also the duty to show that we existed, because we know we did. We have material culture, we have artwork, we have primary source documents relating to this kind of information. And that, I think for a long time, museums wanted to hide anything related to sexuality, but especially same-sex kind of activity. And I think especially when it comes to this attitude of like, what about the children? And, the kids can't be aware of this, focuses on the sexuality piece of it and not on the identity piece of it. And so I think what we're a lot better at knowing now is that, queerness is your identity. It's a part of your identity. It's not necessarily divorced from this kind of sexual behavior. And so when we have our students learning about history, and we have people going to the museums to learn about history and encounter history, we owe it to them to give them a complete view. So I wouldn't look at it as like promoting, queerness in ancient history by reflecting that in museum exhibits or in history curricula, but like my organization talks about, like unerasing, like remove the purposeful erasure that was there for queer and trans people. And I think that, it's only now coming more into focus. And we, as you alluded to, we are seeing a backlash. So, here in the US, you just look to like Florida and Texas, and even just north of me in New Hampshire, there's this kind of preoccupation with kind of rolling back to this moralistic attitude and to reacting to the erasure. The piece of hope that I would add on that is that the Gen Z, the younger people, don't seem to share that attitude by a lot. And so the majority of polls show that, people under the age of 20 want inclusive history and believe that all people should be, accepted for who they are. And I think that is something that we really want to grasp onto.
I think that you captured that so well, seriously, because I just think, culturally speaking, there's so much to be done. And I think I'd never thought about that, like kind of the erasure of damaging literature that's been placed in the past, to marginalize and even just give the wrong idea. So excellent. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your time. Okay, let's move along to Lee Perry. Would you please introduce kind of the organization you work for and the topic that we'll be discussing today?
Hi there, thank you for the introduction. I'm a research scientist. I work for GlaxoSmithKline. I'm also a member of our UK leadership team for Spectrum, which is our LGBTQ employee resource group. And here to talk to you today. It's interesting, we were mentioning Jamaica earlier on. So I'm here to remember the story of Pearl Alcock, who was a Jamaican artist, but was also known as the Black Bisexual Shebeen Queen of Brixton, who ran underground gay bars and created crucial spaces for the Black queer community in London. It was, of its time, the only gay bar in Brixton, and possibly even the first, given the time.
That's impressive. Now, what time was this? What year range did Pearl Alcock kind of come about and start implementing his idea into the culture? So
Pearl's story is really interesting. It's something I resonate with as well, because I grew up very much within the Caribbean community and have been involved in carnival culture for many years. So listening to the stories of my friends' grandparents about when they came over across to England is really interesting. So Pearl came across to England in the Windrush generation during the 1960s. Apparently with £5 in her pocket. Many people came for a better life. It wasn't always a bed of roses here when they came. She made her way up to Leeds and worked as a maid in factories. And raised £1,000, came back to London and opened a clothes shop in Rowton Road in Brixton. I believe it was a bridal shop. She was out and proud bisexual. Sounds like a bit of a character, and didn't take any nonsense. And she started running an unlicensed shebeen, which was an unlicensed drinking venue in the basement of her shop for the Black queer community. She would sell Heineken. I think half a pint of Heineken was about 50p. It should allow people to bring their own records. And people around that time said that you could hear the bass, rattling the pavements coming from the basement. The only other drinking establishment in that area was a place called the George Pub, which was notoriously racist and homophobic, and actually prohibited blacks and gays from drinking in the venue. So Pearl created this really safe space for everybody to come and enjoy themselves, which we don't even really see nowadays. We probably need a Pearl now, really, in London. There aren't enough queer spaces for our Black community. And sadly, with the rise of Thatcherism and her traditional moral values, Pearl was concerned with the vulnerability of her community and closed the bar. They were increasingly, shebeens were being raided by police. So she closed that space. And you can think there wasn't an alternative, really. She then opened a cafe next door. Shortly after we saw the Brixton riots, the George Pub surprisingly was burnt down in the riots, probably due to its reputation. But with LGBT History Month, the theme this year is art. Pearl started drawing and painting. And she started by creating a birthday card for one of her friends, and very much with a her artwork was very much based on her Caribbean upbringing, and became quite popular. She started making bookmarks and selling those, eventually moved on to postcards, and she became quite famous in the art world. And eventually, some of her artwork was displayed in the 90s in the Fire Brigade's calendar, and she ended up in the Tate Gallery in a Outsiders art exhibition there in the about a year before she died. So, you know, she had a really interesting life. And when you think about her background and the colonial laws in Jamaica, Brixton community around that time was predominantly Caribbean, and still is. It probably took a lot of courage for her to be out and proud and create these spaces for people. And she's certainly someone when you think about who you would like to sit down with and have a meal, she's certainly someone I'd like to hear more about her story. And she sounds like an incredible person.
She does. I mean, seriously, I've been researching her recently, and I hadn't known about her before this, the planning of this event today. So it takes, like you said, it takes huge courage. I can imagine what that's like to open establishments and to then unfortunately have them raided. I mean, that's terrible. But she bounced back. I didn't realize, I mean, there was a cafe brought on next door and then postcard. That's amazing. I think that's so cool. And that's just perseverance and dedication to your passion. That being said, these, you people heard the base of the clubs underground. They knew these were occurring. Were these in neighborhoods that were like everyday neighborhoods? Like, and if so, what was the sentiment? Do people kind of just know there's a gay bar there, let's say, and they just keep moving by, or what did that look like on a ground level?
I think it was probably more who you knew. You probably had to know the right people to know where this place was. And Brixton around that time was poverty stricken, really. Unemployment was high. And Railton Road itself, I believe, was made up of squats. And there was gay communities even within these squats. I think a lot of the liberation groups, the British Black Panthers were there. Darkest Howe and Linton Kwesi Johnson, who was a musician, reggae musician, very much with a political message, was from around that area. And I believe the Gay Liberation Front kind of. So it was probably a political kind of melting pot around there. It's probably quite exciting. But interesting. Even when I was growing up, my friends and I would drive around some weekends listening out for bass to find out where these parties were, and you would quite often end up in a house you didn't know whose house it was, and it was crammed full of people. It was so sort of sweaty, the wallpaper was peeling off of the walls, but they were the places to be. We called them blues parties, but it was the place to go. But it was just very much kind of word of mouth and looking for them, really.
That's amazing. And I think, through those, you saw community, you saw camaraderie, you saw gathering of like-minded individuals that can help promote the message, because you're not so isolated when you're in a room of 20 other people that you can identify with. All right, so we do have to move along, but I do want to ask you one more important question. Tell me a little bit about the Brixton riots and how it changed the scene for LGBTQ people in Brixton.
Yeah, so around the time, I was actually 7 years old, and I remember because my uncle was visiting us for dinner that night, and he couldn't get home to Brixton because of the riots. So as a child, I remember them, but there was a lot of racial tension in Brixton at the time, and leading up to the Brixton riots, I think they'd introduced stop and search and were targeting young black youths, and I think they'd actually done around 1,000 stop and search within 5 days before the riots, and people had had enough, really, and rebelled back against the police, rightly so. There was an inquiry afterwards. The that recognised that black youths were being disproportionately targeted, and the government requested that they engaged with the community more on crime prevention before sort of doing these things. And we obviously seen this in recent years with Black Lives Matter campaigns and things like that. So I think it was just something waiting to happen. I suppose in Brixton today, we still see gentrification and people being priced out of businesses and things like that, which we've seen in the gay communities as well, within Soho, and rents just become too expensive. So those businesses can't carry on and are sadly closed down. So it's something we need to keep up the fight and protecting Black and queer spaces. The fight's still on, really, so many years on.
And factoring in intersectionality, the Black experience and then the queer experience may be completely different than the Black queer experience. So I think it's very important you're right, to source opinions from different perspectives. That way we can really grow and know how to grow correctly.
Exactly, yeah.
I just want to comment.
You can imagine. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, you're fine.
Yeah, you can imagine back then as well. The gay scene was predominantly white, and racism was common within the community, and still is to this day, sadly, a lot of the time. So these spaces are really important for people to be able to go somewhere where they feel comfortable.
Absolutely, for sure. And that even goes for like neighborhoods in a city that you live in without respect to LGBT. You want to go to a neighborhood you feel safe in across the board, whatever that means. So wonderful. One thing I'd just like to comment on is I can't imagine what that was like to experience as an adolescent, the Brixton riots, and then see that play out and shape culture and hopefully global culture as well. So thank you so much, Lee, for sharing your perspectives and your insight. Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
All righty, we're going to move along to Cassius Naylor. Where do you join us from, and what topic are we going to be speaking on today?
Hi, Frank. Hi, everybody. I am joining you from the headquarters of the Financial Times. I know we've got a bit of an international audience, so we are a business newspaper. We reach about 26 million people all over the world, about 43% of whom are C-suites in various companies. So the kind of thing that we speak to the powerful in the economy. I am actually I keep getting interrupted. So if you see me looking over, somebody keeps coming into this room. And I'm going to be taking you way, way back from what Lee has been talking about. Sorry, this is a bit disjointed for people. I'm going to be speaking about the nature of queer politics in classical Greece, which is obviously a difficult thing to talk about historically when we're looking at history that's that far back, as Stephen has alluded to in a bit about Roman history. We're kind of engaged in equal parts history and sociology and anthropology because of the lack of primary sources that we have from the period. Obviously, a lot of the primary sources that we have been refracted through the lens of Roman reinterpretation and propaganda in some cases, Byzantine reinterpretation, Abbasid. So obviously a lot of the texts we get from ancient Greece come to us from the Islamic Golden Age, having been saved in places like Baghdad and the Islamic Caliphate, and then back through medieval Christianity, reinterpreted again. Even to this day, Hollywood is still reinterpreting stories about ancient Greece. I mean, I point to the blockbuster film Troy as a good example of, in my opinion, the straight washing of Achilles. So that's broadly what I'm going to be talking about.
I think that's great. And I love that. And I almost feel like we should have started with you, actually. That makes, that's really cool. So we heard a little earlier about the Roman philosophy and ideology and kind of how that played out in culture. And now it started. I mean, where do we know that homosexuality? Do we know where it was first evidenced? And I mean, I know Greece was one of the front runners, but what were the attitudes towards homosexuality in Greece in the early phases?
Well, this comes back to what Emily was saying in the sense that queerness has existed as long as humanity has existed. So as far back as records have. I mean, I can talk specifically about how homosexuality, bisexuality, and general queerness was perceived or treated in the classical Greek world. So when we're talking about classical Greece, we're talking about the period of about the 5th to the 4th century BC. So from the fall of the last tyrant of Athens to the death of Alexander the Great. And very similar to the Roman situation, it's all tied up in class and power and politics. We have the same sort of textual bias around, we know a lot about what the elites were talking about, and not an awful lot about what the general population in each of these places were talking about as well. The important thing to remember about ancient Greece is that it's an extremely politically diverse arena, and attitudes towards homosexuality or queerness in general vary from time to time and also from place to place, because ancient Greece was divided into city-states policy. So Athens, as a policy, had its own kind of attitude, separate from Sparta, separate from Thebes, separate from Macedon and Crete. So there's a massive diversity of attitudes, and as a result, there's been a lot of interpretation about what people's attitude to it was. There's an interesting the point that Stephen was making about the societally endemic bottom shaming is a good way to sort of think about this. So a lot of MSM, men who have sex with men, activity happened under very strict under strict social codes. It usually involved older men and younger men. A lot of the texts talk about men and boys, which sounds like an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but the way the Greeks thought about what a boy was is essentially somebody who hasn't kind of either grown a beard or hasn't passed a kind of social test. In Athens, you actually basically had to go in front of a board to determine whether you were a man. And if you failed that, you could keep failing that test, essentially. So there were people who were considered boys who were in their mid-20s. So we're talking about a very, very fuzzy period of time. But it's definitely true to say that there was a great deal of same-sex activity going on in all of these societies. Thebes was perhaps more liberal than Athens, which in turn was perhaps more liberal than Sparta. But again, we're talking about a 200-year period. And think about how far we've come in 200 years from the 1800s through to now in these attitudes. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to talk about, but broadly widespread. Men and women. Sappho wrote about, we estimate that Sappho, the poet from the island of Lesbos, which is where we get the term lesbian, wrote about 12,000 lines of poetry about women. Unfortunately, only about 600 of them survived to the modern era, which tells you about the source bias that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I'm sure. That's brilliant. I didn't realize that there were different sentiments within ancient Greece. It makes sense that there would be, I suppose. But can you tell me a little bit about the Sacred Band of Thebes? You said they're a little bit more liberal leaning, possibly, or I don't know anything about them, actually.
Yes, I can tell you about the Sacred Band of Thebes, but this is like my geekiest bit of history.
Awesome.
So for context, the city of Thebes was a city in kind of mid-northern Greece, so north of Athens. It's actually one of the oldest cities in Greece, so it goes back to a period we call Mycenaean Greece. So Mycenaean Greece is as ancient to classical Greece, so Plato, Aristotle, as the Crusades are to us. So Thebes is an ancient city by the time we arrive at the classical period. Big rival of Athens, actually sided with the Persians in the story that's depicted in the film 300. Interesting sort of dynamic with the other city-states, and kind of having sided with Sparta originally in the Peloponnesian War, then Sparta having won that war and become very powerful, Thebes pivoted into a role where it had to then balance the power of Sparta. And in the context of that, the Spartans essentially overthrew Theban democracy in around 382 BC, which Athens then helped to reestablish a few years later. This is the context in which we find the Sacred Band of Thebes, which is, I love reading about this, and I love telling people about this. It's a military unit that was founded around that period. It was comprised of 150 pairs of male lovers. We won't necessarily call these gay men, because as Stephen said, the labels weren't really coherent to what we think of now. But 150 pairs of men engaged in a loving, spiritual, sexual relationship. It only existed for around about 40 years. And it's partially documented. Well, the issue is it's actually documented by Plutarch, who lived 500 years later. But the coolest thing about this unit is that when the Spartans came to reassert their power over Thebes, this unit led the Thebans in 2 battles, Tigera in 375 BC and Leuctra in 371 BC. And these are the 2 times in which the Spartan army, legendarily invincible, everyone will know this, we know all about the Spartans, the historical military superpower. This band of potentially homosexual, but definitely MSM, defeated the Spartan army in battle twice and ended Spartan hegemony in Greece forever, basically. Spartans never recovered from this. And it shattered Sparta, and then led to the Thebans actually enjoying a period of dominance in Greece. Unfortunately, only for about 40 years, until our other famously, potentially bisexual character in the period rolls in, i.e. Alexander the Great. At this point, a prince of Macedon under his father, Philip II. Alexander actually himself destroyed the sacred band of Thebes in 338 at the Battle of Chaeronea. And they were unfortunately annihilated to a man in this battle. And it's said that Philip II, who was a famously very, very stern, very masculine, very, very Greek, ironically, a gruff man, is said to have wept on the battlefield for soldiers and actually decried the Spartans' attitude to them. The Spartans were a bit dismissive over this, basically 150 people engaged in buggery, who had in turn defeated them. And he wept and he said, let no one say that anything that these people did was dishonorable. And yeah, I think it's a remarkable little story. It's a good sort of story about the kind of the opposition to what Sparta represents, I think, in a lot of popular history, which is masculinity. And, ironically, we think about it in very homoerotic terms. But yeah, Sacred Band of Thebes, read about it.
I will. Thank you so much. I had no idea. And I did not know that was such a I didn't know a lot about that. So thank you. I definitely have some stuff to look into. So we are unfortunately running short on time. We have another panelist as well. So I want to ask you one more quick question. What was the significance of understanding the history of sexuality and gender for modern activists?
So I like to think about this. I think about this in terms of like being a history buff and looking at or trying to understand the nature of topics we talk about in the modern day and how they're actually, have existed for thousands and thousands of years. But yeah, what is the relevance of understanding why, how gay the Greeks were to nowadays? The underlying sort of thread to this is again, points back to what Emily was saying. This is an indication that, we as a community have existed for as long as humankind have existed. There is nothing new about us. And I think that the nature of sexual politics in this period and seeing just how liberal and how, or at least as we would call it liberal, but definitely how widespread it was way before any of the empires, way before the modern period. It's a nice indicator to me that, progress is never a straight line. Right. It comes and goes, and it gets better and it gets worse, but ultimately it is down to humans. There's nothing central to human nature that inspires bigotry. Bigotry is a social construct. Therefore, it is something that can be worked through. So I recourse to ancient history and all the succeeding centuries of history as a good example of that. Everything that we're dealing with now has been created by us, and it can be unmade by us ultimately, which I think is the message that I kind of wanted to get across.
I mean, and that was so well said. I mean, seriously, because there's so much sentiment nowadays that does not identify with how, the Greeks identified a long time ago. So that's really impressive. And I love that. It takes a lot of courage as well, probably on the global stage, to be such a front runner in such a delicate area. So that's excellent. And I could talk, I wish this was a 2-hour panel because I have so many more questions, but thank you so much for your time. Awesome. Okay, let's move along to Emily Wilson, who joins us also from Synchron. Emily, thank you for joining us. What will you be speaking with us today on?
Today, I'll be speaking about the pride flag.
Excellent. Well, let's get to it then. How did the pride flag start?
So the pride flag started with Gilbert Baker in 1978, and basically he just needed, he wanted something to show, who we are and who we love. So the pride flag is what he chose to just show our diversity in race, gender expression, and age. And it was just a great representation of all of those things.
I love that. And, we've seen, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but we've seen the flags change over the years to implement more colors, different flags entirely representing bi or bisexual, trans flags as well. I'm here in Philadelphia taking the call. I'm based out of Charlotte, but I'm in Philadelphia currently. And Philly also had added a few colors to the flag as well to make it their own, to make it inclusive of the local culture here in Philadelphia. So I know there's a lot of colors. What are the meanings of the colors? And, what were the initial colors to start?
The initial colors were red for life, orange for healing, yellow for sun, green for nature, blue for peace and serenity, and violet for spirit. So there were 6 main colors. Originally, there was also hot pink for sex and gender, and then also turquoise for magic and art. But they were just removed just because of the sheer cost of those specific colors. But like you said, there's over 90 pride flags now. And one of the ones you'll see, most frequently right now is the Progress Pride flag. And that includes the light pink, light blue, and white, which represents the transgender flag. And then also the black and brown stripes, which represent people of color in the LGBTQ community. Then also people that we've lost in our community due to AIDS.
And I mean, that covers such a wide area. And I love that the colors are so vibrant and identifiable. And if you look at Lee's background, you can see all of the colors there, and a beautiful plant as well, by the way. It's a really nice flag. Now, so you told me kind of the initial colors we started with. What was the next addition, I guess? And what did that look like? How was that received culturally?
It was really that, the chevron of, the light blue, light pink and white, and the black and brown stripes, which was added. But like I said, there's over 90 flags right now. And the big thing is, the pride flag is evolving, and it just celebrates the progress we've made, and, the need for more progress and, just gaining more equality. So yeah. The big thing is just, we took the LGBTQ rainbow flag, added the transgender flag, and then also the black and brown stripes as well. So
I think that's great. I knew that there were over 30 LGBT flags, had no idea there were 90. That is amazing. Seriously cool.
We could go on for another hour if you wanted to.
Sure. I'm completely sure. So another question for you. What is the significance of seeing the flag?
I think, the main thing is, it really represents our, community's need for progress and just for the society to be more inclusive. It's on shirts, banners, corporate logos, it's everywhere now. And when somebody sees that in the LGBTQ community, it really just shows them that it's a safe place and a welcome place. So it's really important just to see that flag.
I agree. I think for myself, I identify as homosexual. And when I see, rainbow or ally or pride flags, it makes me feel happy and represented. Definitely. And not like marginalized and not on display. I mean, there's a lot of stigma around presentation and how you identify. But I think that the more that we have these flags and add colors that are representative, the more inclusive that we really can be to fight for progress. So
for sure.
You
see it everywhere now, especially during Pride Month.
Oh yeah, and the cool thing is it's UK Pride Month, or excuse me, UK LGBT History Month currently in the UK. It's October. It's celebrated in October in the US, and Pride Month in the US is June. So the good thing is we have these global events that keep it relevant, keep it without being too much for some, I guess. So talking a little bit about the origin again, you mentioned Gilbert Baker, based out of San Francisco, at least at that time. What I know from that, which I thought was interesting, is he found these, what was it? He found, I think like it was strips of material really, but I don't know exactly from which. I believe in the community center's trash can, I think is what it was. And he came together And I don't know if he chose this. Do you know if he chose the significance of the colors and the meanings, or just formulated the flag?
He did. Yep, he chose the significance, and it was in the San Francisco Community Center right before the 1978 San Francisco Pride, and he just got strips of fabric and then put them into trash cans and then dyed them and then created this big flag for the Pride. And now when you go to any Pride, you'll see this big flag coming down the streets. And it's just kind of symbolizes how it all started with Gilbert Baker and Stonewall riots and all of that.
I think that's amazing. And I know this is personal and we're out of time, but very quickly, I married my partner in Key West. And in Key West, they have huge Pride celebrations. And their main strip in Key West is Duval Street. And it runs north to south, the whole island, basically. And it's over I want to say maybe 2 miles long. And basically, I just want to say that they have, during Pride season, the whole flag up and down and people are just holding it up, walking in the festival. And it's a stunning, I saw a drone footage of it and it's stunning. It really speaks to the scale, and people holding up the flag indicates support. And that makes me really happy to hear. So I love that. Do you think with 90 flags currently, we'll see more? And what does that look like? Like, what are the next, do we have any idea what's coming next with representation or colors or flag changes?
I mean, it's always evolving. The main rainbow LGBTQ flag really represents the entire LGBTQ community. All of the other flags are really just like groups within the LGBTQ community. So we're always going to be evolving and trying to be more, inclusive of other groups. So this is just a starting point. It shows that we're, changing and evolving and supporting, the whole movement.
Absolutely, honestly, because
I don't know how to answer your question. Maybe there'll be 100 plus flags, in the next year or two.
Yeah, who knows, right? I love that though. I think that really speaks, the fact that there are 90 flags, LGBT flags, speaks to the community. I mean, it's not just gay men or gay women
or bears. I mean, these flags get specific.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it does. You're right. And so I think the more representation, the better, because there's so many niche groups within LGBT, and even within the LGBT community, we see stigma, and we see like masculine gay guys are, I guess, maybe regarded as more ideal, possibly. I don't know. But I just know that even within the gay community, there's stigma, and that sucks because we got to break that too. So wonderful. Well, any other final thoughts you'd like to mention on the flag or progress or anything there?
I think that's it. It's just exciting to have that flag and something that represents us. So, for the LGBTQ community and for all of those that we love within the LGBTQ community. So that's it.
Very well said. And I think, and so thank you, Emily, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Frank.
So there was a lot of, and this is speaking to everyone on the group right now, a lot of similarities and a lot of overlap. We saw that this, homosexuality was evidenced years and years and years ago, and it's been, misrepresented or misinterpreted, but it also in some cases have been interpreted very well. And so, it takes both sometimes to see no, this is not right. This is more representative to kind of drive social progress and future initiatives. The only final thing I'll say is that, we got to keep pushing on, keep educating, and keep, we have 14 people on the call now, but we have 61 people on the call now. We had over 100 at one point. This is great because I hope that everyone on the call was able to learn one thing. I learned many, to be honest. And so a lot ahead of us, even though a lot's been done, so much still to do. So, George, would you like to close out the call? I'll hand it back over to you.
Absolutely. Oh, I don't know why my camera put me so dark. Remember that. As the light adjusts, my word. Good afternoon. What a fantastic session. Having been sat here and monitoring the chat and sort of answering some of your questions that are coming in, guys. I'm in love with this. And again, Frank, I'm very similar. It's such a shame this is just sort of the hour, because I could easily at length sit and listen to each one of you for an hour, as it goes on. So really, really grateful for it. And I can see in the chat that our attendees feel the same. So I want to say a big thank you, firstly to Synchronis, as I mentioned at the beginning, who sponsored this event. We're really, really grateful to our partners that do sponsor, but also a big thank you to all of our panelists. You know, it really, this has been a panel I've been looking forward to since it was put on the votes, because as I said, I really do geek out on this, as Cassius said, and Cassius will recall during our prep call, the extent to which we geeked out over the sacred band. So, and the same said with all of these prep calls, it's been so nice to go back over things I did know or discover more about things I didn't know. And I think our audience definitely feels the same. And thank you to our audience also for joining us. For those of you interested, we do have more panels coming up this year. If you join us exactly 1 month today, we have a panel going on about LGBTQ plus parenting, where we'll be talking to the parents of LGBTQ plus kids, as well as LGBTQ plus parents themselves. So do keep your eyes peeled, check on the blog. You can find out more about what we have going on over on our website. We have a mentoring workshop going on right now that you can head over to and join. Details again over on my G work. I will see you all next time. However, thank you very much to everyone, and I'll see you soon.